some familiar faces on here as well. I was just taking a quick look, so hope everyone is doing well. I know some I've spoken to more recently than others, or met more recently than others. Obviously pre-COVID as well, but wishing you all the best as well. But we'll get started here. It's about 3:04. I want to ensure that we do have plenty of time at the end for, again, the question and answering that you'll see on your tabs as well as we go throughout. So welcome everyone to the course on COVID-19 and rent and operating cost obligations and how to survive and thrive. My name is Ryan Cathers, and I'm the manager of healthcare leasing here at Cirrus Consulting Group and oversee our consulting group nationally across the country. So welcome. It's my pleasure to be hosting this webinar today. Now, I think it's important as we get started here to go through a little bit of background on us in terms of who Cirrus is, what we do, and how we support the dental community. So essentially, in a nutshell, we're a healthcare and dental specialized tenant representation firm who essentially specialize in advising and representing dentists in commercial real estate matters. So primarily being the negotiation or the renegotiation of the office lease. And we're actually celebrating our 26th year this year. We've negotiated over 12,000 dental specific leases since inception. And we're really unique in the sense of we're really the only firm of our kind in North America, where we have an in-house leasing team that have access to rental rates and comparables in any given market, as well as obviously our proprietary data, so doctors we've worked with in the area. We have an in-house legal team comprised of highly experienced real estate attorneys and lease negotiators with a background of healthcare and tenant representation, and an in-house consulting team that essentially work alongside the legal and leasing teams to really help develop a strategy for the negotiations. And to give you an idea, on an annual basis, we now represent over 500 doctors each year on various different types of projects, whether it's building out a practice, acquiring a practice, transitioning, renewing your lease, expanding, or as an owner-occupant, creating a lease and a custom lease in between yourself as the real estate asset and yourself as the practice asset for not only tax purposes, but for liability purposes as well. And on an annual basis, to give you an idea, we actually host 100 plus of these continuing education courses. Now, typically outside of COVID, we would also be hosting them as seminars as well as local continuation courses across the country, meeting face-to-face and in person. Now, obviously, given everything going on, we have obviously switched to webinar and virtual for the time being as well. But we lecture at typically most of the major dental conventions. So the Greater New York Dental Meeting, the Pacific Dental, the Yankee Dental, and the California Dental as well. So we truly work with dentists right across the country. Now, 85, 54, and 80. I want everyone to remember these numbers. 85, 54, and 80. Now, keep in mind there is a chat here, but please use, for any questions, the question and answering tab. Makes it a bit easier for myself to see and to be able to respond. Now, 85% of dentists have a lease that can prevent them from ever selling their practice. We're going to get into this a little bit more detail, but 85% of dentists have a lease that can prevent them from ever selling their practice. 54% of dentists across North America are overpaying in rent for their practice. And 80% of landlords structure their lease to give them the right to at least 50% of the proceeds when a practice is sold. I'm going to repeat that. 80% of landlords structure the lease to give them the right to at least 50% of the proceeds when the practice is sold. 85, 54, and 80. Unbelievable statistics when it comes to these particular components. Now, fortunately, that's why we were founded by dentists for dentists 26 years ago, was because unfortunately what began happening were dentists were getting taken advantage of, where they're not as familiar with the real estate and how a lease is structured and how it works. And unfortunately, property owners and landlords, being business savvy in particular commercial real estate, have found various different ways of being able to take advantage of these types of tenants. We're going to get into a lot of these components as we go throughout the lease. So in terms of rent and operating costs and obligations, and how to survive and thrive. So go through some of these first items, the current economic climate. So it's interesting now, obviously a very big difference from where we were 5-6 weeks ago, where we're now at the point where some states have actually fully opened up. I believe Georgia's in there as well as others. And other states or provinces are also looking at still talking about it and having estimated opening dates. And there's going to be a process depending on where you are in terms of what is opened up and when, and if you can as a practice. So I've spoken to many doctors, and what their concern is, even if, for example, they were allowed to open up next week, they don't have the PPE materials to be able to do so, or to do so safely. And so not only with the timeline of opening, but to get proper materials as well is a big component of this. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. So as we're seeing the talks and the economy slowly being able to open up, or at least planning for it, depending on where you are, there is light at the end of the tunnel. Now, there is a smaller window now in terms of taking advantage of this time, which we'll get to in a few minutes from a lease standpoint. Now, in terms of cash flow management. So typically, rent is the third highest expense for a practice. So the first highest expense is typically being payroll and salaries. The second highest expense is usually the merchandise for the practice, or the sundries. The third is rent. Now, with everything being closed down, typically many have unfortunately had to lay off their staff or minimize their staff and minimize hours. So rent, and obviously with the practice being closed, merchandise has not been purchased, or equipment or sundries, things of that nature. So rent has quickly become the most expensive part of a dental practice. And the lease is exactly what outlines what rent or what your obligations, financial and non-financial, are throughout. So there's been a number of different landlord strategies throughout. So taking a look, do we look at structuring a rent abatement or rent deferral? And the difference for those of you who are unfamiliar with those terms is rent abatement is a percentage of rent that is discounted and not paid, and you do not owe it back to the landlord. Where a rent deferral is you're deferring X% from today to some point in the future. And so there's been various different negotiation strategies in terms of, okay, now how is it paid back? Is there interest? What does that interest look like? There's a number of different ways of having that completed, which we'll get to in a few minutes here as well. But there's also been an unprecedented opportunity for new leases, not only renewals. With the uncertainty over the last 5 and 6 weeks, we've seen landlords take a very different approach to our clients that are looking to renew, being aggressive with it, or presenting attractive rental rates, I should say, or other aspects of it, because they want to ensure they're getting their predictable income for the foreseeable future as well. In addition to new leases, landlords have been very, very aggressive at trying to gain tenants into the property. It's unbelievable what they've been willing to do. There's a particular case where a gym had vacated the space at the beginning of COVID, 4,500 square feet, and dentist was looking at set space. Just in free rent alone, they were looking at a year offering just to get that dentist into that size of space, not including any of the other financials. So there's really been some unprecedented opportunity for new leases as well, for those taking a look at it. Now, the window of that aspect is closing quickly, given the light at the end of the tunnel, meaning the economy opening back up. Not to say it's going to be by any means recovered anytime soon, but with it potentially opening up very soon, landlords are delaying or beginning to, the more and more that happens. So there has been a small window that's left, and we're taking advantage of these types of opportunities. Now, in terms of the current economic climate, my apologies. So COVID-19. So as the curve has hit, it's obviously had a tremendous impact on the global economy, and it will continue to do so. It will have a ripple effect moving forward. So when practices open, they will not be producing what they were pre-COVID for some time. And that's known. And so it's about planning ahead, how to structure your lease or plan your expenses or plan your lease around what is going on. How to plan for your practice to see less patients than it did previously for a period of time. And what's the impact of dentistry? Is there going to be a difference in sanitary procedures? What you need to do? Different air systems, different cleaning supplies. And how is that going to be impacting your day-to-day office? So you become more expensive. Is there going to be more time in between each procedure or each hygiene appointment? There's going to be a number of different moving parts that are going to need to be navigated through the coming months. It's going to continually change, based on different relief funds, different standards set out, whether it's from the ADA or the government itself, whomever. So it's about navigating those various different scenarios based on your specific situation. So what is a lease? So as I'm hosting our in-person seminars and continuing education courses, this is a question I always love to ask. And typically in the room with 40 doctors. And it's always interesting. Now, since this is a one-way webinar, I will answer the question myself. So I'll typically go around and ask, what is the first word that comes to mind when you think of a lease? And majority of the room will typically say rent or contract, agreement, things of that nature, obligations. Everyone thinks of the rent check that they have to pay each and every month. Now, unfortunately, what doesn't happen is when I ask for everyone to raise their hand in terms of who has read their lease, out of the average of 40 doctors in a room, there's typically one or two that raise their hand, that have read it cover to cover, which is unbelievable because of the amount that you invest into your space. On average, depending on where you are in the country, it can cost you anywhere from $150 to $250 a square foot of just construction alone. Now, that being said, if you're in a space like downtown San Francisco, where there are union laws, you're looking at $600-700+ a square foot, depending on what kind of quality you're looking for. So very, very important that you're protecting that asset that you've just invested into an immense amount of money, whether you've built out the practice or acquired a practice. The important aspect is, what commitment did you make? As most practices do not look to relocate in their career unless there was an absolute need or have to, whether it's by termination, development, or in the odd case of a doctor looking to relocate to whether it's a new space or property they've bought. Majority of dentists do not look to relocate because it's expensive. Now, what's interesting is when you sign a lease, you're not just signing for 1 month. You're not just signing for 1 year. You're not even signing whether it's a 5 or 10-year lease. The average dentist practices about 30 years, some longer, some shorter. The average is about 30 years. And if, say, for example, your rent is $5,000 a month, no escalations, which we know over the last 10 years has not happened. So if you do a little quick math, assuming rent never increases, which we all know it doesn't, it always increases. Over the course of a 30-year career, how much rent do you pay? $5,000 a month for 12 months, $60,000. Over the course of 10 years, $600,000. Over the course of 30 years, $1.8 million you are committing by the first day you ever sign your lease to the landlord. And that's without increases. So you're looking at well over $2 million you've just committed. Yet, most dentists have not even read their lease. So I encourage you, know exactly what is in your lease. This is my first lesson of today. It's not all about rent. I know this is strange. We're looking at a check. We just talked about how much rent we're committing. My goal today is to teach you it is not all about rent. Rent is the first aspect and first negotiation point that you need to know. If utilized properly, it can help you win in the negotiations. Now, I have a couple questions here. So just taking a look here. So Matt C., what do you recommend us dentists to say when you're asking the landlords for forgiveness of rent for this month or next? Should I ask to forgive my rent or delay my payment? At least delay until I get PPP funds. So this is an interesting one, Matt. So it depends on your situation, on your lease. When does it expire? What are your obligations? What has transpired so far? So many landlords either have entertained that conversations, say today or in the past, or have pointed you towards some sort of relief fund. So PPP obviously being a primary one. Some have received their funds, some have not. So in these particular cases, we can alter our strategy, or your strategy rather, in terms of how to approach the landlord and what exactly to say, because it's very specific in terms of how and what you need to say in order to get a response. Because many will say, okay, well, they won't talk to me. They've never responded. And I've asked, okay, what have you exactly said? I want 3 months of rent abatement. Well, of course, the landlord's not going to call you back because that's 3 months of free rent that they never get. So depending on your situation, we need to develop a strategy in terms of how to ask for the amount that you need of forgiveness. So that's going to be a question we'll need to connect with after in terms of what's transpired, what's your current situation, and who your landlord is and where you are. So you have to dive a little bit deeper into some of these, but there's certainly a proper strategy needs to be developed for it. So in terms of the beginning of the webinar and a taped version, so we should be recording this one that might be available, will be available rather later as well. Absolutely, Howard. Why is the office lease so important? So anyone has questions, keep using that question and answer section as well. It's easiest to be able to reply. But why is the office lease so important, especially during COVID and post-COVID? Your office lease is the foundation of your practice. It's the foundation. As you may hear, location, location, location. It is the document that ties you to the space that you practice out of. No space, no practice, where do your patients go? So very, very important that it's a properly structured lease to ensure that you have predictability in that space. Secondly, failure to pay rent could be catastrophic. I encourage each and every one of you, if you can pay rent, pay it. Because unfortunately, which we're going to get to in a few minutes here, and as Rose, you've asked here, in terms of a section of catastrophic or pandemic and things of that nature, we're actually going to touch on that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. But if you don't pay, you could trigger a whole number of other items. I'll get into a little bit more detail of that in a few minutes, but absolutely pay your rent. We'll get into some of the different triggers, if you will, in a couple of minutes here. The investment and cost to build. So I've already touched on the per square foot cost to build out a dental practice. And again, it varies depending on where you are in the country, what materials you're looking for, and the size and so forth. Very, very expensive to build out a practice, a very large investment. It protects the investment that you're making. Very difficult, expensive, and time consuming to move. So I'm not sure if anyone out there has relocated a practice, but for those of you that have, many I see a shaking head in my seminar with a smirk saying it was an absolute headache. It's time consuming, it's long, it's expensive, it's always more expensive than what you expect. On average, and again, depending on where you are in the country, it takes you anywhere from 18 to 24 months to properly relocate a practice. 18 to 24 months to properly relocate. By the time you have just the concept or idea or need to relocate, to finding a space, negotiating the lease, constructions, permits, until doors open, architect, and so forth. 18 to 24 months. Now, if you're in the Bay Area, for example, you may need 3+ years because of the demand. Or for in Southern California, certain areas as well, very, very difficult. So depending on where you are, again, 18 to 24 months is the average. The landlords know this. So critical, your lease states not only the expiry, but the options to renew. It can also make or break the sale of your practice. Would you prefer the lease works as an asset or a liability? It can make or break the sale of your practice. And it gives you leverage. You're also one of the only tenants that sign a long-term lease. Whether it's restaurants, gyms, salons, they typically only sign short-term leases. You invest a lot of money into your space, your long-term tenants, and you typically pay your bills and pay your rent on time and not a headache for the landlord. That's immense leverage for you as a dental tenant. As much as they know you don't want to move, they don't want to look for a new type of tenant. What should the office lease do for you? So first and foremost, it should provide fair and affordable financial terms. But I'm not just referring to rent. Rent is one of obviously the main aspects of the financials, but I'm also referring to escalations. Are your escalations fair? Or many of you are on what's called a triple net lease. So historically, leases were gross leases where there was one rent and everything was encompassed. All operating expenses, maintenance on the building, taxes, insurance was all in that. It did not fluctuate. It did not increase through the year. At the end of the year, it increased X amount based on the lease. What a triple net lease is, and what's more prominent now, because landlords began to realize expenses rose quicker than renewals did. And so they split it up into a base rent and operating costs, or triple net charges, which is made up of taxes, insurance, and maintenance of the building. Now, the particular one to be concerned about is the maintenance. In some cases, that's where landlords will utilize and overcharge tenants and utilize as a profit center. So we need to ensure we're entitled to detailed and itemized statements and the right to audit those statements. Have our CPAs take a look to ensure that you have full transparency on what you're paying for. Very, very critical. Or if you're looking to expand or start up a practice, the fixturing period. So the amount of time that you receive possession of the space, but you don't have to pay rent. Do you have a fair amount of time? We're looking at 4 or 6 months of fixturing. Plus, on top of that, looking at additional months of free rent. So when doors open, it helps alleviate additional financial burden. Or tenant improvement allowance. So the money that the landlord's willing to give you in order to help outfit the space. Now keep in mind, that's not necessarily free money. Typically, it's baked right back into the rental rates you pay. Now, am I suggesting don't take any? Absolutely not. Because in some cases, it can be very advantageous to take some. But more isn't always better. Depending on the evaluation they have, it might be better to go to your financing department or lender, bank, to borrow from them. In terms of the couple questions here, we're going to touch on that in just a couple minutes. So I will get to them. Now, in terms of long-term stability and security, in most cases, not all, but most, we recommend signing a 10-year term with multiple 5-year options to renew. And this does a few things. So one, it has long-term stability to it. You have 20 years of predictability. Two, if you're not looking to move, why not have the stability and security for yourself? It's like buying in bulk, and you typically get a better deal when you're offering a 10-year term and the leverage for it. Where it also becomes important is on the sale of the practice. Banks typically now need anywhere between 8 to 10 years of term left on the lease in order to finance an acquisition. And that's whether that's in the form of initial term and or options to renew. As long as the options to renew are transferable to a buyer. Very important. If you're unsure and you're looking to potentially sell your practice in the next 5 to 10 years, absolutely critical you confirm that your options to renew are transferable, or have someone confirm for you, which we'll get to that aspect in a few minutes here as well. If you're unsure, happy to assist. But minimizing risk and exposure. So many of you, without even realizing, have signed a personal guarantee or have even personally signed your lease, which essentially means if there was ever a dispute between yourself and the landlord can come after you personally. We need to be creating limitations on these personal guarantees. So if you're a new tenant to the building, very common. They don't know you. They don't know that you've shown covenant that you will pay your bills. But if you've been there from time, you pay your bills on time, your rent on time, and there's no issues, there shouldn't be any reason to be providing one. So at the very least, we need to be creating some sort of limitation, whether it's expiries, caps on monetary value, or some sort of blend. Or if you've been in that space for a long period of time already, and the previous, professional that you had worked with regarding your lease and did not remove it yet, that is absolutely a primary concern and primary objective for the next renewal. Incorporating what's called a death and disability provision. So essentially what it states is that God forbid something were to happen to you and you're no longer able to practice, you or your estate would have the ability to either A, terminate the lease, or B, assign the lease, and it skips some of the typical terms and provisions based on the extreme circumstances. And in either case, many ask, well, why would I want to terminate? I would want to sell as quickly as possible. Absolutely. What this protects against is, say, for example, you can't sell quickly. A doctor nearby, which is very common, offers to buy the charts, but does not want the real estate. So you have the ability to quickly sell the charts and terminate the lease. Maximize your flexibility. So incorporating in what's called the right of first refusal to expand. So if you're thinking about potentially expanding your premises or your space, if the adjacent space becomes vacant, and there's a number of different ways of having it structured, but essentially you have first right to it. The landlord has to either offer it to you first or with a bona fide offer to match, or however it's structured in there. That way you have the option, but not the obligation to expand your space if the opportunity comes up. Or the right of first offer, very similar to purchase the property. The lease should enhance your ability to eventually sell your practice. Would you prefer a smooth transfer and a sale or a bumpy transfer and sale? Would you like it to work as an asset or a liability? Because again, the lease can make or break the sale of your practice. Now for cash flow management. Payroll, rent, lease obligations, there's going to be a number of different components through this. So again, as we spoke about before, there are non-financial and financial obligations. So in terms of your financial obligations, so base rent is obviously a big component and the main component. But another aspect, as Pavi has inquired about, is can we ask the landlord to give a break in the operating expenses? That's what I think it's meant to say. So it depends. So these are all components of it. The CAM fees, the operating expenses, these are all financial components. Can we ask? We can ask for anything that we want. The question is, are they going to agree or accept? That's the other side of it. So depending on your situation, depending on what's transpired so far, particularly over the last 5 or 6 weeks, your relationship, the type of landlord, where you are, will change the strategy based on your situation, on how to approach it. Because these types of situations is very strategic in terms of how and what you say. So to add on to that, Pavi, it really depends on your situation, and specifically what's transpired currently, what's been the past, and what is your leasing situation. Now, in terms of unpaid rent and TI, so if you have built out a practice recently or have been owed tenant improvement allowance, whether it's for renovations, an update, things of that nature, do you have any unpaid amounts that you just haven't gotten receipts over to the landlord, or you realize that you haven't been paid on something you should have, as long as you've had all the proper documentation? Great time to obviously ask for it. Cash flow is tight. So if you do have any unpaid or unsure, let me know. Obviously, we can review and see what exactly the exposure is or what you're obligated for. So a few of the non-financial aspects. So I'll quickly put everything up here so everyone has the ability to take a look through. So the lease obligations and the non-financial. So being the default provision, don't stop paying rent. This is what I mentioned earlier. Please do not stop paying rent. It can trigger many of things. There's a doctor recently who did not pay their April rent and were accelerated through. The landlord required them, based on the lease they had signed, to now top up their security deposit by 3 months of accelerated rent and pay April's rent instantly. So instead of having to try and pay 1 month, they had to pay 4. How much rent do you pay a month? How much would that equal? A loss of benefits. So if you negotiated tooth and nail for an exclusivity when you had moved in, many of those exclusivities are tied to not being in default of the lease. If you are found in default, you can lose your exclusivity or your options to renew. So if you thought you signed a 10-year term or a 5-year term and multiple 5-year options to renew, or whatever the number of options to renew are, they are absolutely tied to you not being in default. How is it structured? Do you lose your options completely? So when your lease expires, your lease expires. There's no predictability past that. If you're found in default, in many cases, the landlord has the ability to ask for your financial statements, not only your business. If you've signed a personal guarantee or have signed personally, or depending on how this is structured, they may have the ability to ask you for your personal financial statements. How comfortable are you with the landlord knowing your personal finances? An inability to assign. So if you're in default, you may not be able to assign your lease and sell the practice. How could that impact your retirement or your transition plan? Very, very, very important. And termination rights. So depending on how yours is structured, the landlord may have the opportunity or the ability to terminate your lease. And many will ask, well, that's not into their benefit because I'm a good tenant. What happens if their plan? I was speaking with a doctor the other day where the property owner had tried to get the property redeveloped or zoned for it. So that way, at the end of the leases, they were all short-term in this medical building to kick everyone out. They denied him at first, and now recently, they've been accepted. Default provision, this doctor's just received a termination right, a notice, because they did not pay. It gave leverage to the landlord to be able to utilize this particular provision in order to free up space so he can eventually redevelop the property. So very, very important to know your obligations and what you need to do. So if you're not familiar with your default section, please, 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 I encourage you, read it either during this webinar or afterwards as well. If you're unsure of how to read it, send it to me. We'll review and provide some feedback. It's at info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com. But additional lease, non-financial aspects. So some of these here, I know is one question from Rose. So I know it's taken a little bit of a while, Rose, but what Rose had asked is, what do you do if you don't have a section for pandemic or catastrophic incidents? Is rent negotiable, or am I still technically obligated to pay rent? So we're going to tie into that in just a second, Rose. And in terms of the force majeure clause, so the force majeure clause is essentially an unforeseeable circumstance that prevents someone from fulfilling a contract. Now, this is a particular cause that many have really ignored over the past, decades, because it's referring to, the act of God. If God forbid something were to happen with, whether there was a war, a government shutdown, or something that prevents the landlord from being able to provide their service, or from yours. And what, unfortunately, majority of them have been typically structured, not all, but majority of them, the overwhelming majority, have been referencing is if the acts of gods are happening and you're no longer able to practice in your space, they will not be able to hold you in default for your legal terms provision. So if you have a normal business hours section in your lease and you're supposed to be open a minimum amount of hours, they will not hold you in default for that. But you are still obligated to pay your rent and additional rent each and every month. Now, what many have realized is, in many cases, their force majeure clause does not reference, and this is for you, Rose, any pandemic or catastrophic references, which is what this is. So what happens? How does that change with the lease? How does that impact? Are you still obligated to fulfill the lease obligations? And depending on how yours is structured, absolutely. Not only for the financial terms, but the legal terms as well. Obviously puts you in a bit of a predicament if things have been shut down or open only for an emergency. So it's interesting. We have seen some landlords work with tenants, obviously, to get through this as a team, but others have not. So it's very important to know exactly how your lease is structured and what it exactly says, word for word. And is the rent negotiable, or are you still technically obligated to pay rent? You are 100% obligated to pay what you've committed to in rent and additional rent. They are under no obligation to negotiate anything. Now, that being said, have they been negotiating any sort of rent deferrals or rent abatements, things of that nature? Absolutely. But in many cases, they ask for something in return, where it's some sort of deferral with interest or an extended term in exchange for a deferment. You want to ensure that you're approaching the conversation strategically. What is the situation? Where are you? What type of landlord? What's transpired so far? Let's review the lease. What needs to be amended and fixed? Okay, now let's approach it. So that way we have a proper approach for it, or you have a proper approach for it, depending on the situation. But it's very important that you approach it strategically for it. Unfortunately, this provision is typically only landlord friendly. As much as we all would like it to be tenant friendly, unfortunately, landlords all have it structured where no matter what, essentially, you're still obligated to pay rent. So what to look out for? There are other critical business impact clauses that are through your lease. We're going to touch on just a couple quickly today, given the time, but many different aspects, whether it's a demolition clause where they have a termination right in the event they look to redevelop the property, continuous operation, meaning you have a minimum hours you have to be open each week. Obviously, one of the biggest impacts right now with everything going on. The personal guarantee, are you entitled to it? Do you have it? Is it expired? There's surrender provision, so if you ever to leave, are you required to restore the space back to its pre-dental condition? There's a doctor I was speaking with a few weeks ago who spent $32,000 on a 1,400 square foot practice to restore it back to pre-dental condition. Expensive bill to be surprised by. Now the option to renew. So the option is the option, but not the obligation to extend your lease further. So this is found in 90% of leases that we negotiate, and many of which have been negotiated by a quote unquote dental specific real estate attorney. So it's very interesting through this in terms of the dental specific aspect. So we're going to go, we typically in a course, I would go through this slowly. Now, given this is a one-way webinar, and in terms of timing, we're going through a little bit quicker. I'm going to go through it now. And so the orange writing is that could be problematic. So in the first half of the sentence, it states that this option to renew, provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as the tenant. So the problem with this is if Dr. Black was ever to sell the practice, these options would not transfer to a buyer. Why is that an issue? For a couple of reasons. One, there's less runway for that buyer to come in, makes the practice less attractive because they don't have long-term stability and security. Two, buyer might not be able to get financing. If Dr. Black has not committed to 10 years today, he cannot sell that practice to that doctor. It needs to be transferable. There was a doctor who had reached out to us to ask a few questions where she had negotiated with her local attorney a provision just like this that was personal to her. It was a 5-year term plus a 5-year option, conditionally sold her practice, predicated on the lease transfer. And the landlord leveraged this one line amended for $120,000 to allow the option to transfer to a buyer for financing for $120,000. Unbelievable. They could have really asked for anything. They needed it for financing. So it's imperative to see if your options are transferable. In many cases, they'll get crafty, where the tenant has to be the original tenant. So very, very particular in terms of how they've structured it. In addition, it states and goes on to say, and if the tenant duly and has regularly paid its rent and has performed its covenants and obligations under this lease, and has not been in default. And you'll notice the word D, or the letter D in default, where it's capitalized. If there's a capitalized term in the middle of a sentence, it's because it's a defined term, meaning somewhere in the lease, default is defined. Now, typically, in this case, it's in the default section, which we've outlined a number of different aspects that could constitute a default, not limited to, but some of them. So you need to be sure what could constitute a default, because again, if you are in default of your lease, your option to renew becomes null and void. But it goes on to say, shall have the option to renew this lease for a further term of 5 years, exercisable by written notice to the landlord, no less than 9 days prior to the end of the term. Any such renewal shall be on the landlord's then current standard form lease. That should raise major big flags, red flags, where that means the landlord can present you with a whole brand new lease and have you sign that because you've agreed here that it's on the then current standard form lease. Meaning maybe they've inserted a demolition clause and a termination right because they're potentially looking to sell the property and you've already committed to it. It goes on to say at a minimum rent to be determined between landlord and tenant, but in no event shall it be less than the rent paid in the last year of the original term. Meaning, which way is it going to go? Up. If the landlord and tenant are unable to agree on market rent within 60 days of the exercise by tenant of its option to renew, the rent shall then be determined by arbitration based on the market rent for renewing tenants in the building. What happens if there was a tenant in your building who had received, for example's sake, $150,000 in tenant improvement allowance and had agreed with the landlord to pay it back via rents? So their rents were significantly raised, but was agreed upon in order to outfit the space. Are you now obligated to pay that rent and not receive the $150,000? because that's the way this is structured. So very important to know exactly how your rent is determined on your option to renew, because you might be currently, as it stands, either protected or exposed to an exponential increase in rent, particularly if you're in a hot real estate market. So I have a question here from Evan Gupta. It's great to see you, Evan. But during the renewal process, if the landlord wants to add additional terms to the renewal, can you reject the new terms and still renew based on only the terms of your original lease? So if you express an option to renew, that you express it according to yours. So right here for this example, no later or no less than 9 months prior to the expiry. So if you've satisfied all the obligations that you need to under your lease, and in a timely manner, properly express your option to renew, depends on how the option is structured. So in most cases, the only things that change are term and rent. Now, given in this particular case, it states on the landlord's then current standard form lease. So in this particular case, unfortunately, they can make changes. In most cases, they can't, but it depends on how yours is structured. So in terms of yours and your specific question, what they're looking to add, we should connect afterwards to see if it is appropriate or not. The assignment section of your lease. So the assignment section essentially outlines the transferability of your lease in the event that you look to sell the practice. And so this is actually found in 75% of the leases we review. And again, we review over 500 dental leases a year, or represent 500 clients a year, let alone review significantly more. If the tenant should wish to assign or sublease the premises, it should first have received the consent of the landlord. Very, very common in commercial real estate. But it all depends on what those consent terms and provisions are. Does it just state that the landlord cannot be unreasonably withheld? What are the terms and conditions of unreasonable? What is the definition of unreasonable? It goes on to say, any request for such consent shall be in writing within 15 days following the receipt by landlord of such request for consent. The landlord shall have the option to 1, approve tenant's request to assign the lease or sublet the premises, 2, decline the tenant's request to sublease, assign and sublease the premises, or 3, to terminate the lease. So they have the ability here, and found in 75% of leases, regardless if the doctor knows about it or not, to 1, approve, 2, decline, or 3, to terminate your lease. What is your practice worth if your lease is terminated? I was speaking with a doctor yesterday who, this one was about a week ago now, and they had been advised by their practice broker to let the term expire, just stay month to month until you sell your practice. $1.8 million producing practice. Was advised to go month to month until they sell the practice, let the buyer deal with the lease. So are you crazy? You're leaving your $1.8 million asset at risk where the landlord can terminate your lease. Let alone your assignment section where they also have the ability to terminate your lease. You're leaving that up to a buyer to potentially mess that up or muddy the waters or walk away after that. So absolutely not. You need to do this to ensure that you protect, 1, your asset, but 2, maximize the value of the practice. But it goes on to say, landlords shall have the right to revise minimum rent to be paid during the term, the greater of the then current market rent, or 15% greater. Meaning, just for asking for consent and transferring that lease, they can increase your rent or the rent paid on this lease to either current or at least 15%. How would that impact your practice sale? How would that impact the evaluation? Would they ask for a decrease in purchase sale price? Could they walk away? It also discusses furthermore, and it goes on to reference consideration, which references sale proceeds. meaning the landlord is entitled to the percentage of the sale proceeds of sale. There's a daughter who I was speaking with 3 months ago who had been in a space for 35 years. His landlord was a good friend, a quote unquote family friend of his, been a patient of his for 19 years. He conditionally sold his practice, predicated on the lease transfer. He went to his landlord, quote unquote family friend, as per his lease, to ask for consent. And the landlord said, happy to, on one of three conditions. One, your rent is increased 30%. Two, you pay me 50% of the sale proceeds, 50. Or three, I terminate your lease. I can tell you there were some very choice words about it afterwards. But unfortunately, the way his lease was structured, he had the ability to. Now that was one of our more extreme situations we've unfortunately been having to speak to about, but more common for landlords to be leveraging anywhere between 15 to 30% of sale proceeds. When in reality, structured properly, there should be zero. That's your retirement. Now it goes on to say in the last sentence that even if the landlord would consent to the transfer of the lease and the sale of practice, that you would stay liable and remain liable for the lease obligations should the buyer default. If you've signed personally or a personal guarantee, that's both your business and you personally. There was a doctor down in Michigan who had sold his practice, moved down to South Florida to retire, had received a call 8 years later on the beach. Buyer had defaulted. I'll never forget the phone call I received end of 2017. Absolutely needs to either be released or limited. Now, in terms of when to start the process, so we typically recommend beginning the lease negotiation process or renewal process and preparing for it 24 months out at least for leverage. Because again, on average, it takes 18 to 24 months to relocate a practice properly. Not to say you're looking to, but at the very least, it gives the perception that you could if they're being unreasonable. Because they know the more time or closer you are to your option to renew deadline or lease expiry, if you don't have any options to renew, the more leverage the landlord has. So begin the lease negotiation or preparation process at least 24 months out from expiry is absolutely critical. So a few negotiation strategies. When does your lease expire? How do we ask and what do we ask for in terms of a rent relief or rent deferral? The additional rent, what do we do with it? There's rarely any maintenance on the building. Do I still have to pay that estimated amount? What do I do? Take action now. Figure out what's in your lease. What are your strategies? What are your goals and visions for the long term? Let's evaluate all of the above, what's transpired, what's happened, current and past, so that way we can properly plan for the future. And have your lease professionally reviewed. So in terms of unprecedented opportunity, so landlords have been unbelievably open for long-term lease renewals and resetting the financials, being rental rates and comparables on them. Now that window particularly has been closing, more specifically as the world opens back up, that will slowly see a decrease and decrease back to normal because they're just going to delay to see, okay, how quickly is this going to rebound? But while everything is still in flux, this is the time to do it, including for new starts. So if you're looking to potentially start up a practice, we've seen amazing rental rates and comparables presented. So it's been unbelievable in terms of financing options. Have never been lower in terms of interest rates. They're nearly zero depending on what you're looking at. Equipment supplies, the payment terms have been unbelievable as well. So in terms of some of these questions, I've just got a couple more slides to go through and then I will address those questions as well just in a couple minutes here, save for time. So in terms of landlords, they're desperate to fill vacancies. So they're looking for, if you're looking to expand or to build out, they are looking to get that filled. So an unprecedented opportunity for those as well. Now, in terms of knowing the rental rates and comparables, so we have all of that data in terms of your potentially your building, the area, and our proprietary data as well. What are dentists actually paying? Now, in terms of the strategic Cirrus process, we have an 8-step process, as you can see here, where we're gathering all the documentation, all of the original lease, extensions, amendments, estoppel certificates, assignment agreements, all of the lease documents, and final executed from both sides. You need the very, very final copy. And you should have the final copy. If you don't, you absolutely need to get it. You need to identify your practice goals and career. So what do you want to do? Is a plan to bring on a partner, stay long-term, relocate, buy property? What are you looking to do, and evaluate that? Review the office lease. So all of the risks, exposures, liabilities. Prepare market research, so all the financial comps. An outcome and strategy. So we develop this first. So this is our process. We look at the document, go through your practice career goals and visions, review the lease in detail. We do our market research. Then we develop a strategy all before reaching out to the landlord. Very, very, very important. And typically what happens first is we negotiate economics, so the financial aspects of this. Typically term, rents, and if it's a new deal, any sort of build out costs, fixturing periods, things of that nature. Typically on average, this is about 15 hours on average to negotiate. Once completed, that's when we move on to the lease terms and provisions, so the legal work. All the different provisions, all the different items within each provision, back and forth. Typically on average, that's about 35 hours to negotiate back and forth. And then once we've received the final review of it, or the final copy, we ensure we finally review it word for word as if it's the very first time we've ever reviewed it. Because unfortunately, the amount of times landlords have said, oh, I forgot to change that, or oops, I forgot to add that in. You'd be surprised. Anything that's been agreed upon has now been changed. So we finally review it prior to final execution. And I know we're just about at 4 o'clock here Eastern, so just have a couple more slides to go through, then I will get to questions. In terms of critical dates and risk analysis, it's one of the services we're providing, and it's essentially a lease review, where it's a $1,500 value, or $1,495. We spend 3 to 4 hours analyzing your lease and for traps. So essentially, in layman's terms, it's an economic and legal analysis of your lease, where our leasing team will go through the rental rates, comparables, to determine if you're overpaying in rent or not, while our legal team goes through the legal terms and provisions in detail, so highlighting all the risks, exposures, liabilities. We then schedule a call with you and go through 3 different aspects: your goals, your vision, the traps within your lease and the exposures, and what needs to be amended, and then essentially a treatment plan at the end. So there's no obligation for it. It's part of one of our services. And so today, we've actually offered, given everything going on in collaboration with our sponsor, Henry Schein, we've actually offered every attendee today to receive a lease review complimentary. So what I need from you, if you are interested, is your original lease, including any extensions, amendments, estoppels, or assignments for when you acquired the practice, if you did. Please send that to either info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com. Let us know if it is urgent. There will be a polling system in just a minute here. Please note, if it is urgent, we will be tending to those first and foremost. If you're curious as to what's in your lease, send us a lease as well. If you are wondering how to approach your rent deferral or rent abatement conversations, we will still need a copy of your lease to determine the overall strategy and what exactly could occur when and so forth. If you're curious on anything of your lease, send us your lease or your situation. info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com, and please again reference if it is urgent. We will be scheduling those first. Now, in terms of the questions, so going through a few of these here, in terms of Matt, so if we utilize your services, what are the fees for different services? So it really depends on the scope of the project, Matt. So as part of the lease review, it also gives us an idea on the scope. So we will walk you through, again, there's no obligation. But at the end, we'll be able to determine, one, if we're able to help, and if we are, what that would look like, what capacity, and what the investment would be in terms of us. And so once we've reviewed the lease and discussed your situation and your goals, we'll be able to walk you right through that in terms of if you would like our assistance through that. Dr. Rashimi, what type of improvements should we ask for when renewing the lease? So it really depends on your situation. So in some cases, there are some cosmetic improvements, whether it's flooring, paint, things of that nature. But depending on your situation and what you pay in your lease, it may not be advantageous. So what I mean by that is, again, tenant improvement allowance isn't free money. And so in many cases on renewals, landlords, not all cases, but in many of them, will increase the rental rates and have such an interest on your amount that they're giving you. Say, for example, they give you $5,000 for just cosmetic improvements. You may end up paying back $10,000 over the course of the term without knowing. So depending on your lease, depending on the rental rates that are structured, in some cases, we recommend either personally financing or going through a loan with the bank. It might be cheaper, or in some cases, it may be a good deal to take from the landlord. But that will depend on your lease, where you are, your type of landlord, because some landlords won't have it in terms of capital, things of that nature, or unlikely to, or unwilling to. But there are a number of different variables there. It'll all depend on your lease, and we'll be able to discuss that through the lease review as well. So any other questions as well? So we still have some time here. I see here that we do still have 52 participants on. Happy to outline any questions that you may have as well. Well, it's been a pleasure, everyone, as well. I'll stay on for a couple more minutes here, but if you do have any more questions or specific to your situations, many of them are, we will certainly be able to go through them via the lease review. Again, it is complimentary. There is no obligations for that. Everything has already been paid for by the course sponsor through that as well. So, Rose, I see your question. I'll answer in just a second here, but in terms of it, obviously, any questions, many of them will pertain specific to a situation, geography, type of landlord, and what's transpired so far. So a lot of that is seen via the lease and getting into a little bit more details and weeds of it as well. So in terms of Rose, her question is, what services do you offer buying and selling practices? So it's really anything to do with the lease. So we can assist in whether someone's looking to build out a practice, acquire a practice, whether you're a buyer or seller of a practice. In terms of what capacity we'll help with, happy to walk you through and give you an idea. But we help with lease renewals, lease expansions, transitioning doctors, lease creation, lease deferrals, abatements, really anything pertaining to the lease, we typically can help with. Now, via the lease review, we'll be able to know if we can help depending on your lease and how it's structured and the expiries and so forth, or what capacity we could potentially help with, or we may not be able to help, and I'll just be providing some feedback for you in terms of what could happen, what you should do next, and how you should approach your next steps, depending on the situation and what the project might be. So I'll be able to kind of go into a little bit more detail in terms of more of a one-on-one in terms of specifically what you're looking for and things of that nature and what the project might be. So I see here in the chat, there's another aspect here. Give me a quick second. So I see one from Lily. So the question is, essentially, can we negotiate a cheaper rental rate before the lease expiry? During this time, I assume this might be renovations. I'm not sure, but in terms of that, one really depends on how the lease is structured. I'll have to review it. as well. But in terms of negotiating a cheaper rent now, I mean, it depends on what you're looking for. I mean, if it's a rent abatement, deferral, an extension, it's going to depend on a lot of different variables. So again, let's connect after that. That's more of a specific situational type of question that it'll be a lot easier to answer more specifically once we've gone through a few of the details there. So I have a question here as well. Hiring a dentist, is it considered subletting? Depends on how they're getting paid. So some landlords will argue a dentist being a subtenant depending on how they're getting paid. What their statement is, are the employee, an independent contractor, and so forth. So really depends on how your assignment and subletting section is structured and how the compensation structure is for that dentist and what the agreement is between yourself and them. So in terms of, I guess, a little bit more of a specific answer, we'll have to connect on that in terms of a few of those details as well. But hope that helped kind of to start that answer. Any other questions? So we have one from here. So we have a question here. I'm month to month after 15 years subletting from other dentists. My rent is already way too much. I have no access to work on patients as we all do at this time. So with practices being closed, what's a good starting point? Some of my friends are paying half. So in terms of this particular question, first of all, no dentist should ever be month to month, because what that means is twofold. One, you or the landlord, or your sub-landlord in this case, have the ability to terminate your lease on 30 days notice. Makes you in a very, very difficult position in terms of that. No predictability. Secondly, there is what's called an overholding or holdover provision in your lease that outlines that month-to-month aspect, where in many cases, they may have the ability to charge you 1.5, double, or even 3 times your current monthly rent. So I'm not sure if that's a factor in that as well, but obviously a very big factor. They can also backdate that. For any doctor that is month to month on here, absolutely urgent that we speak immediately about your lease. Should never be month to month. You are very, very exposed. Now, in terms of this and this particular aspect, what's a good starting point? Well, we need to regroup and discuss your long-term plans. Or are you looking to stay long-term, short-term? Because if you feel your rent is too much, it could be because you're month to month. It's a short-term aspect where the part of the negotiations are to have predictable income, not only for you, but for them. So that could be a part of it as well. And if you're looking to sell, and I see your long-term plans here, you'll need a lease in place. You won't be able to sell a practice if you don't have a lease, as there's 3 components made up of a practice sale, being goodwill and your patience, your equipment, depreciated value, and then the lease and the location. If it's a turnkey practice, that's when you gain maximum value. So in terms of, I see a few different aspects here. So in terms of some of these specific questions, so to give a better and more specific feedback on some of these, send us your lease, info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com, and I'll be able to actually give you proper feedback on your sublease and proper strategy in terms of how you need to have it structured, what your next steps are in terms of being able to accomplish some of these goals that you've put here as well. So we're looking at some of the more general, like cross country type of answers. If it's specific to a specific area, we should connect specifically, as I do want to keep it at a high level for these types of items. So in terms of This aspect in the recent and the investment and fees and so forth of us, it really depends on the scope of the project. So we'll be able to walk you through that once we've been able to discuss with you what the project even is. Obviously, very impossible for me to tell at a high level right now, as there's plenty of services and involvement of us and how involved we are and so forth. So again, we'll need to review the lease to see the exact situation and discuss what are you even looking for. Because right now, I mean, it's just all up in the air. So we'll need to get a little bit more specific on that aspect. So in terms of yes. So if we've negotiated a lease as a past client or a client of ours at any point, we have the lease on file. Yes. So we've got a few more questions coming in here. In terms of the recently announced, so this is in particular to Canada, commercial rent relief program, which I know there's also PPPs, and I'll get into that in just a second as well for the United States. But what is the best strategy to approach the landlord? So again, this really depends on your lease, your situation, your landlord. There's no cookie cutter way of approaching it because it's all very specific to you and specific to your situation, because your situation is going to be different from the doctor down the street. So in order to have a proper strategy with that, we'll be able to walk that through via the lease review as well, or just to connect separately on it as well. But we will need to go through details in terms of what's transpired past, present, and what are your future goals to be able to properly approach any landlord, whether it's any form of relief. So not just focused on the commercial rent relief in Canada, but as well through the PPP. So I know many have received their funds, many have not. And there's going to be the second round of funds being distributed throughout. And so what happens now and what occurs when you do receive them, and how does it operate? So there's a big component to both of those. So depending on, again, region specific, we'll get to the geography specific ones on a one-to-one basis as well. So in terms of Harvey, yes. Let's connect afterwards in terms of a one-on-one basis on that. So that way I can get into a little bit more detail there. So one question is, I'm still not sure you've addressed how to negotiate the rent for not using rented space while not using it presently. So in terms of your rent currently, if nothing's been agreed upon, you absolutely need to pay rent. Now, in terms of how to negotiate that, it really depends on your specific situation. So some of the different factors that go into it is, when does your lease expire? Have you been up to date on paying rent? Who is your landlord? Is it a family run, an institutional? How good of a relationship do you have with them? Is it, how much do you need? Do you need half a month, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months? It all depends on what you need and how much. Because there's some cases where we've negotiated short-term deferrals, for example, where we've taken 2 months of free rent now and added it onto the back end. So the landlord wanted interest and would not agree to a no interest deferral. So we added 2 onto the back end where the doctor would pay the higher rent in exchange. But that's what was needed in that specific case. Another case was a deferral where there was no interest but amortized over 12 months. Some landlords won't agree to that long of an amortization schedule. So in terms of how to negotiate, that's going to have to be more of a specific conversation based on your specific situation, what's transpired so far. Because if someone hasn't been paying rent for months, very different type of conversation than someone who's up to date. So I apologize. It's tough to get a little bit more specific and granular with it, but I'll need to be able to speak with you one-on-one in terms of your situation and the lease dates and what's transpired so far, and complete proper due diligence beforehand. So the overwhelming, I guess, lesson here is proper due diligence. Don't just call the landlord based off of 1 or 2 quick comments. Let's strategize. And again, many of these cases, we might not be able to help. We may just recommend, and I'll walk you through how to have that conversation of a rent abatement or a rent deferral conversation with the landlord. Because there's some cases where we can't get involved, or there'd be no sense in us getting involved. It would be a waste. And so many of these conversations I've had recently, particularly on more of the rent abatement and deferral side, is look, your lease has 9 years left. The likelihood is the landlord's not going to be changing anything drastic. So I'll walk you through, this is the conversation to have. This is the, if they say no, say this. If they say yes, say this. If they say no, say this in response. And I'll walk you through what to say, how to say it. But it's going to depend on your specific situation based on a number of variables. So unfortunately, tough to answer very specifically right now, but I'm happy to walk you through it and what to say and how to say it and so forth. Because again, it is complimentary. There's no obligation. So to connect on a one-on-one basis afterwards, happy to do so. So it is just about 4:20 here, Eastern time. So 1:20 if you're on the West Coast, and if you're talking Hawaii, even earlier. If you're out on the East Coast, then or Atlantic time, obviously a little bit different. But it's been a pleasure speaking with everyone. I hope everyone found this insightful, and looking forward to speaking with many of you afterwards in a little bit more detail. But again, a pleasure. Thank you for joining. Be well, stay healthy. If you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information is there. info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com, and we will schedule some time. And if you just have some quick questions as well, happy to address those too. But in the meantime, be well, stay healthy, and we'll talk soon. Thanks, everyone. Take care.